Yeah, I'm laughing just because I am so horrible at reading. It's laughable. But I've been trying to read this little piece of fiction and make a video of it because I was thinking that my CRPS has been very bad the last couple of days. And I was thinking about how it seeped into some of my fiction. And just as a way to express it, I had a poor, pitiful, outcast Blackfoot Native American have an unfortunate accident happen to him, just as a way to express uh, the misery and oddity and horror and mind fuck that is CRPS. And I'm going to try yet again to read this. It's probably, I should probably just try to read a paragraph, but unfortunately it's longer than a paragraph. So now that you know what you're in for, yeah, you can click this off if you haven't already. But I'm going to give this a shot. And I have to go down here and hit WordPad. And it might help if I click this like so. Okay. A one, a two, a three, a four. By the time he felt the earth giving way beneath his feet, it was already too late. He overrode his reflexes as he had learned to do long ago, but he could not override the nature of things. He tried to let himself fall rather than digging into the hillside with his feet, because he knew the fallen tree at the bottom of it was waiting for him. But he could not fall sideways and roll into the log. The mossy brown obstruction grew as he skidded on his back. His right instep caught underneath the wooden obstacle, and his momentum carried the rest of him over it, twisting his knee and wrenching his foot. He had no wind to cry out, though. His left side slammed into the log. His knee screamed, blocking out all other sensation, as he rolled beside the dead tree. When his breath returned to him, he let out muted cries and groans. It wasn't long before he realized that the dizzying pain meant serious injury. He knew what he was. He knew that such an injury most likely meant death. It was difficult enough for him to survive when he was healthy, let alone weighed down with a bad leg. It was early spring. He had wintered in the bear's cave and eaten its flesh, but winter was winter, and he was weakened by it. And now he had made one misstep, and in his world, that was all it took. He gave himself over to despairing fear for a while, breathing rapidly and uttering pitiful sounds. He stayed beside the log for some time. He told himself he wanted this to be the end, that he wanted to just lay there and wait for death, for a predator to come for him. But he knew better. It would not be that simple. Before a wolf or a bear would come, thirst would come, and hunger. Then the wound throbbing on his side would become poisonous, opening up nether worlds. For he knew that no matter how horrible one's situation, there were always greater orbits of misery to slip onto, whirring and spinning inside men, catching them and holding them further away from hope. He tried to move his injured leg, and his eyes watered. He broke into a heavy sweat. Nausea gripped him when he looked and saw that his right knee was already swollen, pulling his legging tight. Continuing his inspection, he discovered that his right ankle was also swollen and too stiff to move. He reached up and trailed a finger through drops of blood beside a jagged stub on the log. Peeling up the shirt he wore, he looked at the wound he had felt earlier. The leather shirt had protected him a little, but the laceration that sat atop a contusion was still bleeding freely. The man scooped up a handful of the soft earth that caused his misfortune in the first place, working it into a brown-black cake. Then he gritted his teeth and pressed the cake onto his cut. Closing his eyes, swimming in pain, he pulled his shirt down and forced himself to try. He sat up, and his leg hurt. He used his wooden assailant for support, gathering his good leg under him, and his leg hurt. He raised himself up and sat on the log, and his leg hurt. The foot he kept raised using his stomach and hip muscles touched ground, and his leg screamed. He lifted it back up out of reflex, but then he let it settle down again because he knew he couldn't hold it up forever. His ankle and knee began a throbbing duet that tore at his sanity. He might have lost control completely if it wasn't for the squirrel. The black shape caught his eye and his hand went right to the bow on his shoulder. He notched an arrow and waited for the squirrel to come closer. It hopped along, digging in the soft earth and twitching its big black tail. When the animal turned sideways to him and bent its nose to the ground once more, he snapped off a shot. In amazement, he watched the shaft of his arrow swaying back and forth with the squirrel's death throes. Now he had to find a way to get to his next meal. He looked at his arrow, an incongruent weed in a patch to his right, a few paces up the hill. Sliding his backside along the log, he sat beside a thick branch that was not as rotten as its tree. Moisture from the ground had not sped up its decay because it pointed outward at an angle. He cut it for a walking stick. With his right arm wrapped around the stick, he stood up. He had never used a crutch before, so he crawled along slowly, holding his right leg up, ever mindful that agony was only a hand or two from the ground. He ate the squirrel raw, and raw meat always made him thirsty. The last water he had come across was on the other side of the now impassable hill. He thought about going around it, but he was exhausted from just hobbling over to his kill. There could be other obstacles around that hill that would block his way to the water. Besides, it was his habit to move toward new ground when faced with such a choice. His arm was raw from the awkward way he had clutched his walking stick, and he knew he should find one that had a bend in it that would fit under his arm. After a brief rest, he found his way upright again, but he hesitated. He had trouble imagining the pain that would sear him if he fell, but he could see himself falling. He was sure that it was more than just a strong possibility. Moving downhill on one leg was going to be much more difficult than going uphill, regardless of the danger, so he sat back down and slid on his backside. When he got to more level ground, he used his stick to stand again and began to hobble away. His one thought was to find water. He didn't want to spend the night full of pain and thirst. Wood sound filled his ears, and he moved along, listening closely. Now that he had become a one-legged shuffler, the woods had changed. The familiar scratching and scuffling, calling and answering that had greeted his ears spring after spring had turned into something else. He had turned into something else. He was now a stranger in the lands he had roamed season upon season. The quiet around him told him that all the creatures in the area knew he was there, and their quiet was as unnatural to him as his poke and hop of stick and foot was to them. The stillness filled him with naked dread. A suitable branch with a sharp bend in its thick part caught his eye, and he shambled over to it. It was time to trade up, so he reached for the Nepaquan tomahawk he wore in his belt. With his left hand on the trunk of the tree and his good leg straining, he began to chop. The limb was almost too high to reach, but he kept at it with awkward half swings. It was the best crutch candidate he had seen, and the arm he was swinging was heavily abraded from his old stick. After cutting off the limb and sizing it properly, he had himself a decent crutch. Accomplishing that much had given him a little emotional lift. Added to that, he had also managed to kill fresh game in his crippled state. And when he smelled water, he felt a little more hope. Soon he was hopping down a mild incline toward a slow stream. At other times he would have passed on, looking for swifter, clearer water, but now he couldn't keep himself from drinking. In frustration, he realized that just getting down to the water so he could drink was going to be difficult. He stood over the stream a good while and looked around. The place had a dank, unhealthy smell, like the bottom of an over-rich stew. Water or no water, he didn't like it there. He looked across again and saw bushes moving. The long ears of a white-tailed deer poked up, and he didn't hesitate. He went for the bow with one hand and an arrow with the other, but the eyes beneath those ears caught the movement. His arrow sailed behind the animal as it sped off. He looked in his quiver and saw only 3 arrows. Shrugging, he sat down and rolled onto his left side. He brought his hand up to his mouth again and again, tasting only cool wetness. At least he wouldn't be thirsty when night fell. He crouched by the water and waited. With his left leg under him and his right thrust out straight, he carefully dug his right heel in the soft mud. He would have to spring off of his left leg anyway. From behind the sumac leaves he could see the game trail, as clear as daylight to him. He let his eyes flow down the trail to the shallow backwater. The water was low and surprisingly clear. Again he reminded himself that at least this was a likely place, a good spot to hunt. He let the spear rest on his shoulder, freeing his mind to wander and distract him from the pain. He walked through the last few days. Sickness, lost arrows, sleepless misery, cold rain, and hunger. Awful hunger. Not the everyday kind centered in the belly, but the marrow-deep, weakening kind, the kind you don't feel so much as live. The information all blended together, and he could make no sense of it, so he could not distract himself by thinking about what he should or should not have done. After the squirrel, he had eaten little else. He had not been able to kill any more game, and it was early spring. The buds were barely on the trees. Fruits, nuts, and vegetables were not available yet. Even bland and bitter edible roots were not available. The roots were there, but the shoots and leaves that marked them weren't. And even if they could be located, one needed to rove a good distance to find them. He knew that hopping around would weaken him more than the hidden caches of nourishment would strengthen him. He needed meat. He needed a big kill. It was as simple as that. It was a strange twist of the bowstring that hunters often fasted to eliminate the smells that nourished bodies produced. And his body was indeed empty. The first water he drank after injuring himself had made sure of that. First had come the awful cramping and cold sweats, then the horrid emptying of his bowels. He thought that something was in the bad water that his body could not tolerate. So, after recovering a little, he had searched for a new water source. On the way to the backwater, he had shot at another deer and a rabbit. When he found the clear water, he had spent his last arrow. He hadn't even known what he was shooting at. He had just seen some weeds moving and snapped off a shot immediately. Old habit had taught him to shoot quickly at close game. The arrow could always be recovered. Only this time he had found neither animal nor arrow, no matter how he searched. What had disturbed him even more was that he had not even seen any tracks. So now, he had no real weapons for hunting, and he could not simply make himself more arrows. Arrow making was a tricky and time-consuming skill. He remembered watching the village arrow maker shaping and smoothing wood all day, every day. Few learned the skill with any kind of proficiency. It was easier to just let the expert do it and pay him for his specialty. But when he had gone out on his own, he had been forced to learn, and he had learned that to make an arrow that flew straight was no easy chore. Added to that, you needed an arrowhead and green leather to bind it to the shaft, and you needed feathers to guide the wood through the air. If I could kill a bird now, he thought absurdly, I would probably eat the feathers too. He stood for a few moments and flexed the muscles of his left leg. His right leg would take a little weight now, and it was less swollen, but it was also as stiff as a lodgepole, and the pain was still there, though it had retreated deeper into the leg as a less intense ache. He stretched and flexed his arms, shoulders, and neck, and blinked his eyes dizzily. Then he resumed his crouch. He really had no other plan. There were no options to weigh. His limited strength and impaired mobility had left him no other choice. While trying to think of what to do, he thought about snares. He remembered the two dead boys and their noose, but that made him think about him, and he could not allow himself to do that. This was different country anyway, but it was not too far from his village. The man had never strayed far since that day of the Wolverine. Then his mind had gone way back to his wee times and days of listening to the aged gumming their yarns. A particular story had struck his fancy as a child. One of the men had told of how he had wanted to prove his stamina and stealth as a young man. He sought to kill a deer in the old way. So the man took a fire-hardened spear and crouched by a waterhole. He hid his scent and waited, the trick being to hold so still and breathe so slowly that the deer wouldn't become aware of him, even if he was right beside him, an arm's length away, and the deer had to be an arm's length away if it was to be killed with a lance. In the story, a bear had come, not a deer, and the bear had rubbed against the frozen hunter like a scratching tree. After knocking him over, the bear had ambled on, looking for a sturdier scratching post. The man said he had called it a day after that, having his proof, if only for himself. When he had come back to camp, no one believed him, though they appreciated the tale and retold it many times. So now I am gambling my life on an old man's tale, he thought. He heard a stillness in the air and wondered at it. He bumped his arm against his left side and winced. The cut did not look good. It was swollen and terribly sore, but at least it did not have the telltale green tendrils around it that meant suffering and death. He had treated it as best he could, mainly just washing it and covering it. He was more concerned with hunting. He could do something about getting food. Whether his wound took poison or not was beyond his control. Either way, he was under the weight of time like never before. And even though there was a certain resolution in deciding on one course and sticking to it, he had forced himself into an either-or situation. A path surrounded by ever-widening orbits, awful detours beyond life or death. Okay, well, I don't know if the dog barking out there that was distracting me is picked up in the file or not, but yeah, I wrote that and made that poor character go through all that because the left side where the wound occurred, where he rolled into the log, that's my hypersensitivity. The bad leg and ankle, the muddied mind from the pain, all of that is all part of CRPS. And I had written something else in a different style, since, you know, if I got you this far, I might as well try to look that up. That's real short. And it's really hard to do this sort of thing just in a house without a sound room, because you got dogs barking, you got people walking above you. You got this, you got that messing with you. And anyways, I'll be looking through here. And we'll see what we can find. This is written in a different style. And this is a... I really can't remember what the age is of the guy. The age of the story is a kid in high school. But it might be from the perspective of him as an older feller like me. I don't remember. But I'll just keep on babbling away. I need to practice my reading, if that's not obvious to you, that I was stumbling and stammering there, but I fought through it. And it's just not an easy thing. I don't know, maybe it's an easy thing for other people. I'm just amazed when I hear people that do audiobooks and do well at it, because it's just so very hard to do. And then they have a thing called Audio Vox where, schlubs like me can just volunteer to read books, and a lot of them are pretty bad, I gotta admit. They don't have the voice for it, and they're just not good at it. It's just, they're just bad. They're not listenable. I don't know. I irritate myself when I listen to myself read, but I've been practicing and trying it, but it's kind of against the grain. It's not a talent I have, so I'm still looking. I should have did a search or something to find this part in here. It's not too far along. Okay, there's my boy Ian, who is the character that the perspective comes from. And it's got an interesting turn of phrase in it or two. Oh boy, do I feel boring right now looking through my work. I feel vain and boring at the same time. Man, what a deadly combination that is. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and read the whole thing. This is the character sort of breaking the fourth wall. He says, "I don't know if I'm breaking any taboos, but I'm going to write about writing. You read books by people and they never talk about the fact that they are writing. Maybe they think being too self-conscious about twirling the pen, like I'm doing now, or punching the keyboard, like I'll be doing later, will screw up the creative process. Or maybe they subscribe to the theory that the writer can weave some kind of magic spell that makes the reader forget he is holding dead trees bleeding ink. Perhaps they think they'll break that spell and jar the reader out of Victorian England or the Old West or whatever. Well, sorry if you feel jarred. And as for screwing up the creative process, so what? I've written crap before and I'll probably do it again. I came to the game late, forced out of a penalty box I banished myself to long ago and thrown onto an empty field, competing with no one for nothing but definition, an answer to a question I don't even understand but am forced to ask. It is a question with no words, a self-interrogation that results in a charlatan's magic trick. Poof! See? There is something, someone there. See these lines and patterns and dots and squiggles? Someone had to make these. They must mean something. But what? What is an answer without a question? What else? Nonsense. But I have to ask. It doesn't matter if I don't even know the question. It doesn't matter if the answer gets lost in forests of ink. It only matters that I ask. Because of what happened, because of what I am, if I don't, I dissolve into pain and madness, flow into a stagnant pool full of diseased and grinning parasites, safe from their predations only because I have allowed myself to become one of them. So yeah, it all goes in. Might as well put that other failed video up too, for people that, for the couple dozen people that enjoy listening to me talk. This is the second video I made today because today I am very bored. I heard more bad news that I unfortunately can't share with you due to the nature of the internet, involving someone being jailed I might as well lose these. And I don't feel good today and haven't felt good. But anyways, what I really would like to do with that first person novel is, if I could pull it off, if I was some kind of thespian, is to just read it and look into the camera and be the character writing the book, because it's written in the first person. And that would be very cool if I could do that. But man, the work involved in that and my lack of talent with that sort of thing, I don't know. I don't think I'm up to it. I don't know if I was up to that 30 years ago. But yeah. Anyways, that's 25 minutes of your time. So I'll just go ahead and post the two videos. And I don't know how I read on here, but as I always have to remind myself, and I am reminded by in the analytics when it says that what my average watch time is like nobody is forced to watch these things. So anybody can click on them and say, wow, man, that is not the most handsome dude I ever seen, and there's nothing really here to look at, and he seems to talk about himself a whole shitload. He's just another egomaniacal YouTube person with too much damn time on their hands. And I can understand that perfectly. I don't have a problem with that. But that was a bad sentence. I don't even know where that sentence began or end. I only know that it had a middle. So anyways, this is the end of me for today. That sounded ominous. It's getting dark. I got to go feed the cats before it gets dark and the raccoons come out, because the raccoons don't let nobody eat. They won't let the cats. They'll devour all the food and chase the cats off. And they come out about this time. And as always, I hope you have a better day than me. And if you're going through the benzo thing with me, all I can tell you is it's a slow process, and tell you the same old platitudes everybody tells you. Is it will get better. It has actually gotten better for me, definitely, and that's reflected in the arc of my videos. And considering the character arc, I guess, since I'm reading novels and such. But if you look at the one video on here where it looks like I weigh 95 pounds, not that I'm all bulky and shit now, but it looks like I weigh 95 pounds in the video, and I'm in tolerance withdrawal, and it's just called a benzo addiction despair. I've definitely progressed, and I've had a lot of bad luck here recently. So I I feel fortunate to progress the amount I have. But as far as like the encouragement that I can give to anybody going through this, is it's just a long process. And any little signs of improvement, you have to seize upon and take those. And if you don't feel like you're improving, you have to also understand that the improvements, it's not it's not like a steady climb up a hill like this. Even if it's like at an angle, like this. Lots of times, recovery goes like this. You feel down again, then you feel a little bit back up. It might be a good while, and then you might feel down for a good while, and then you might feel back up. But it's a long, slow, agonizing process, and it's difficult. And this is sort of my way of coping with it, is doing my little vain little videos here where I chatter away. I'll share something with you that's very personal and weird to me. But I grew up in a Catholic background, which means the movie The Exorcist scared the shit out of me, because I was taught to believe that if I dug a hole deep enough, and I actually asked somebody this that was part of a church, like that part of my family was going to. I said, so wait a minute, you telling me if I grab a shovel and I start digging in the ground and I dig down far enough, I'm going to end up in hell, not China? And she's like, yep. And I was like, okay, I don't really have any more questions to ask you. That pretty much says it. But anyways, that's the way I was raised, was to believe that hell, demons, and all things were all literal things. Like I could take a shovel and go shake hands with the devil. Or take a shovel? I could take a shovel and go shake hands with the devil if I felt like it. So I had a dream that I would occasionally have this nightmare periodically where I would feel like possessed. And whenever I was possessed, I was not allowed to talk. So I took that as a sign that I should talk. So that is what I do, and my battery is dying, and I have to leave you right now at that. So goodbye. I better turn this off before I lose it all.